The German tanks advancing that morning didn't know they were already dead. For 4 years, armor had moved through infantry with near impunity, not because it was invincible, but because no one had figured out how to kill it reliably. That changed in December 1944. A young American sergeant lies awake in a frozen foxhole, counting seconds as 3 Panzers approach his position. No support, no retreat. Only a bazooka loaded with an experimental round that almost no one believes in. The documents say it can do something tanks were never designed to survive. Not by overpowering armor, but by exploiting a flaw no doctrine accounted for. If the documents are wrong, the sergeant dies immediately. If they're right, German armored tactics built over a decade become obsolete overnight. This is not a story about bravery. It's not a story about superior technology. It's a story about how one overlooked principle of physics quietly dismantled the psychological dominance of armor. When the shot is fired, there is no drama. Just a brief white flash, and in the seconds that follow, German tank crews across Europe begin learning something terrifying. Infantry no longer needs permission to fight back. The German tanks advancing that morning didn't know they were already dead. For 4 years, armor had dominated infantry combat across Europe, not because tanks were unstoppable, but because they were predictable in one crucial way, and no one had broken that pattern. Every army understood the same rule. Tanks advanced. Infantry reacted. Rifles could kill men. Machine guns could pin units. But against armor, infantry existed to delay, distract, or die until friendly tanks or air support arrived. That wasn't cowardice. It was math. Steel thickness versus bullet mass. Gun caliber versus human bone. There was no debate. By 1944, German armored doctrine relied on this reality. Panzer units moved with confidence through infantry-heavy terrain because history said they could. Infantry would scatter. Infantry would freeze. Infantry would wait for help that usually came too late. American reports had a name for it. Panzer paralysis. The moment when infantrymen stopped thinking tactically and started thinking existentially because nothing they carried could change the outcome. That morning near Bastogne, Sergeant Jim Morrison was inside that moment. He had been awake for more than a day. The cold had stripped sensation from his fingers hours ago, and through the fog, he could already hear the sound that meant his options were gone. Tracks, slow, heavy, unconcerned. 3 Panzers were moving toward his company's position. No American armor was nearby. No air cover could fly in that weather. And retreat meant breaking cover under direct fire. By every rule of the war so far, this engagement was already decided. But slung across Morrison's shoulder was something that didn't fit those rules. A bazooka, not new, not impressive, and usually not trusted. Most infantrymen treated it as a weapon of opportunity, not certainty, effective only at close range, only against exposed angles, only when the tank crew made a mistake. German tankers knew this. They trained for it. They angled their armor. They kept distance. They trusted steel and doctrine to protect them. What Morrison carried that morning looked identical to every other bazooka round he'd trained with. Same diameter, same launcher, same weight in the hands. But inside his pack was a document marked classified, and inside the round was a claim so extreme that most soldiers who heard it assumed it was propaganda. The claim wasn't that the round could damage a tank. It was that it could defeat armor outright. Not by brute force, not by lucky hits, but by exploiting something no tank doctrine accounted for. A flaw that had nothing to do with courage, nothing to do with tactics, and nothing to do with who was braver that day. A flaw rooted in physics. If the document was wrong, Morrison would die in seconds. Not heroically, not meaningfully, just erased when the turret completed its rotation. If the document was right, something far larger than 3 Panzers would collapse. Because German armored tactics weren't built around the idea of invulnerable tanks. They were built around the belief that infantry could not reliably kill them. That belief shaped everything. How close tanks advanced, how aggressively they pressed attacks, how exposed commanders felt standing in open cupolas, scanning the battlefield with confidence earned over years of survival. Morrison watched the lead tank slow. The commander was visible now, standing upright, scanning for threats that fit the old rules. The turret began to turn toward the tree line where Morrison's unit was dug in. This wasn't a heroic moment. There was no speech, no plan, no decision to change the course of history. This was a forced experiment, the kind that happens when theory finally meets reality. The bazooka rested against Morrison's shoulder. The sight settled, and for a brief moment, the outcome of 4 years of armored dominance balanced on whether a single assumption was still true, the assumption that armor could only be defeated by armor. When Morrison pulled the trigger, nothing spectacular happened. There was no explosion, no shockwave, no cinematic fireball, just a brief white flash, and in the seconds that followed, something invisible but irreversible occurred. German tank crews across Europe began losing confidence in a rule they had never questioned. Not because infantry became braver, not because American technology suddenly became superior, but because a hidden vulnerability ignored for years had finally been exposed. And once infantry learned they could fight back, they didn't need permission anymore. Before December 1944, American infantry did not distrust the bazooka because they were ignorant. They distrusted it because they had used it. On paper, the bazooka was a breakthrough, a portable rocket launcher that gave infantry a chance against armor. In reality, it was a conditional weapon, and war does not respect conditions. The standard bazooka round could penetrate armor only under circumstances that rarely existed in combat. The tank had to present flat armor. The impact angle had to be close to perpendicular. The range had to be precise. German tank crews knew this. They trained to deny those conditions instinctively. They angled their hulls. They kept moving. They exposed only sloped armor. They learned that distance itself was protection. Every meter a tank stayed back reduced the bazooka's threat. And so infantry learned the opposite lesson. If a tank appeared at range, the bazooka was useless. If it appeared up close, survival depended on panic, luck, or sacrifice. This gap between theory and reality is what created Panzer paralysis. It wasn't fear of death. Infantrymen were already surrounded by death. It was the certainty of helplessness, the knowledge that no decision they made could change the outcome once a tank committed to the attack. Between mid-1944 and the winter, this certainty killed thousands of men, not because German armor was unstoppable, but because American infantry lacked a weapon that worked reliably. The bazooka didn't fail because it was weak. It failed because it tried to solve an armored problem with brute force, explosive energy against steel, hope against engineering. That approach had already reached its limit. What engineers eventually realized was that armor didn't need to be cracked, shattered, or blasted apart. It needed to be bypassed. This is where the story usually gets misunderstood. Most people assume anti-tank weapons evolved by becoming more powerful, bigger warheads, more explosive, more impact. That's not what happened here. The breakthrough wasn't about power. It was about precision. For decades, physicists had known that explosions behave differently when shaped. When a cavity was placed inside an explosive charge, the energy didn't expand evenly. It focused. Instead of pushing outward, it collapsed inward. When lined with metal, especially copper, that collapse formed a jet traveling at extreme velocity, not fast like a bullet. Fast enough that solid metal briefly behaved like fluid. This wasn't new science. It wasn't secret science. But turning that principle into a weapon infantry could actually use created a problem engineers couldn't solve easily, because shaped charges don't just require detonation. They require distance. A precise gap between the warhead and the armor surface. Too close, and the jet never forms. Too far, and it disperses before impact. That gap, called standoff distance, was measured in inches, and the bazooka was a terrible platform for maintaining inches of precision. The rocket wobbled in flight. Its speed varied. Its orientation changed constantly. Any shaped charge mounted on it would strike armor at unpredictable distances. For years, This problem stopped development cold. Engineers could build shaped charges that worked in laboratories. They could build shaped charges that worked on static targets, but none that could survive real combat conditions until the casualty reports forced the issue. By late 1944, infantry losses from armored encounters weren't just unacceptable, they were strategically dangerous. If infantry could not fight tanks, entire defensive lines collapsed the moment armor appeared. This is when American weapons developers stopped asking whether a solution was elegant. They asked whether it was necessary. The answer was yes. What emerged was not a radical new launcher, not a heavier rocket, not a more powerful explosive. It was a subtle modification that looked almost trivial. A hollow metal extension on the nose of the warhead. Its purpose wasn't penetration. It wasn't damage. Its purpose was to control distance. When the rocket struck armor, that fragile nose would collapse first, absorbing the impact, stopping the warhead at exactly the correct standoff distance. Only then would the explosive detonate. Only then would the copper liner collapse inward, forming a jet that didn't care how thick the armor was supposed to be. This design choice solved three problems at once. It stabilized detonation distance. It reduced sensitivity to impact angle, and it turned sloped armor from protection into a liability. Armor no longer needed to be flat. It just needed to be present. The result was the M6A3 heat round. Externally, it looked identical to older ammunition. Same diameter, same launcher, same handling. Internally, it represented the collapse of an assumption every tank crew relied on. That assumption was simple. That infantry weapons could only hurt tanks if tanks allowed it. The M6A3 didn't overpower armor. It ignored the rules armor was designed around, and that is why almost no one believed it would work. Soldiers had heard promises before. They had been handed weapons with optimistic manuals and unrealistic expectations. Most assumed this was the same, until the first rounds reached the front, until tanks began dying without warning, until the psychological contract between armor and infantry was broken. Back in the frozen forest, Morrison didn't know any of this history. He didn't know the years of failed prototypes, the abandoned designs, the arguments between engineers. He only knew what the document in his pack claimed, and that in front of him were 3 Panzers, operating under rules that might no longer apply. The turret continued to turn. The moment of theory was over. What remained was proof. What Morrison carried on his shoulder looked ordinary because it had to. If the weapon appeared unfamiliar, soldiers would hesitate. If it required retraining, it would arrive too late. If it demanded new launchers, it would never reach the front in time. So the engineers hid the breakthrough where no one would notice. Inside the round, the M6A3 heat rocket was designed to fit every existing bazooka without modification. Same diameter, same balance, same firing procedure. That decision mattered more than any performance statistic. Infantry didn't have time to learn a new weapon in December 1944. They needed something that worked now, under stress, in freezing conditions, with exhausted hands. The innovation wasn't dramatic. It was precise. At the heart of the M6A3 was a copper liner, machined into a cone with tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch. Engineers tested dozens of cone angles before settling on one that produced the most stable jet without sacrificing penetration. Too shallow, and the jet stretched too thin. Too steep, and it lost coherence before impact. The final angle wasn't chosen because it was elegant. It was chosen because it worked consistently. Behind that cone sat the explosive charge Composition B, a mixture of RDX and TNT. Hotter than TNT alone, faster, more violent in its collapse. But neither the copper nor the explosive was the true breakthrough. The critical component was the hollow steel nose extending forward from the warhead. It looked fragile because it was. Its job wasn't to survive impact. Its job was to fail first. When the rocket struck armor, the nose cone crumpled instantly. That collapse absorbed the initial shock and stopped the warhead at a precise distance from the steel surface, exactly far enough for the shaped charge to form correctly. Then, The base detonating fuse fired. In less than 1/10 of a millisecond, the copper liner collapsed inward, not melting, not shattering, flowing. The metal accelerated into a narrow jet, traveling several times the speed of sound. This jet didn't behave like a projectile. It didn't bounce. It didn't glance off. It created pressures so extreme that solid steel temporarily behaved like liquid. Armor wasn't cracked. It was displaced. The jet punched through, carrying molten copper and steel fragments into the crew compartment. Everything inside became secondary shrapnel. The entry hole was small, often no larger than a coin. The damage behind it was catastrophic. This is why early observers didn't believe the results. They expected explosions. They expected torn armor plates and visible destruction. Instead, they saw intact tanks with crews dead inside. That contradiction confused people. Small hole, total kill. It didn't match intuition. And intuition is what tank doctrine had relied on for decades. Tank armor was designed to defeat blunt force shells, impacts, penetration by mass, and velocity. It was never designed to defend against a focused jet that ignored thickness and angle. Sloped armor, once an advantage, became unpredictable. Spare track links and welded plates sometimes helped. Sometimes they didn't. Nothing about the engagement looked dramatic enough to warn other crews. There was no visible fireball, just a flash, and then silence. This was the real danger. The M6A3 didn't announce itself. Tank crews didn't know they had been targeted until after the damage was done. Back in the forest, Morrison didn't know any of this physics. He didn't know cone angles or jet velocities. He didn't know about tolerances or standoff distances. He only knew what the document claimed, that if he could place the round correctly, the tank would die. As the lead Panzer slowed, Morrison adjusted his aim. He didn't target the thickest armor. He targeted geometry, where the turret met the hull, where angles changed, where steel overlapped and systems clustered. The tank commander was still standing in the open cupola, still exposed, still confident. That confidence was earned. For years, infantry had proven him right. The turret continued to rotate toward the tree line. Morrison felt the familiar weight of the launcher settle into his shoulder. He wasn't calm. He wasn't brave. He was focused. When the trigger was pulled, the rocket ignited with a sharp crack. The back blast vanished into the trees behind him. The round crossed the distance in less than a second. When it hit, there was no explosion, no roar, just a brief white flash at the point of impact. For a moment, nothing happened. The tank didn't move. The engine continued to idle. This pause mattered. It gave the illusion of failure. It reinforced everything tank crews believed about infantry weapons. Then, the hatches blew open. Smoke poured from the cupola. Metal clanged as internal systems failed. Inside the steel shell, the shaped charge jet had already done its work. The kill wasn't cinematic. It was clinical, and it was irreversible. Behind the lead tank, the 2nd Panzer stopped abruptly. Its commander had seen the flash. He hadn't heard an explosion. He hadn't seen incoming fire. But he had seen a tank die without warning. Doctrine offered no answer for that. There was no formation for it, no maneuver, no training response. Only one rational decision: withdraw. Within seconds, the 3rd tank reversed into the fog. For the first time in years, armor ceded ground to infantry without a fight. Not because the infantry advanced, but because the assumption that protected tanks had failed. Morrison lowered the launcher. His hands were shaking harder now than before. The weapon had worked, which meant the war, in some small way, had just changed. Not because of a new gun, but because a quiet rule had been broken. For a brief moment after the flash, nothing happened. The Panzer didn't explode. It didn't burn. It didn't even stop moving. Its engine continued to idle, a steady mechanical growl cutting through the cold air. For Morrison, that second felt longer than the last 31 hours. Every doubt he'd pushed aside rushed back in. Maybe the documents were wrong. Maybe the round had glanced off. Maybe German armor really was as invulnerable as everyone believed. That pause was dangerous. It was the moment when men usually died. when infantry realized too late that their last option had failed. Then the hatches blew open. Black smoke burst from the commander's cupola, thick and sudden. Metal clanged inside the turret, sharp and wrong, like machinery tearing itself apart. A figure emerged from the top hatch, young, barely more than a boy. His uniform was on fire. He scrambled onto the turret roof, lost his footing, and fell hard onto the frozen ground. The flames followed him. Morrison didn't move. The tank's engine kept running, blind and autonomous, but no one else came out. No shouts, no gunfire. The shaped charge jet had already passed through the crew compartment. Anything alive inside had been shredded before pain could register. Behind the lead Panzer, the other two tanks reacted instantly. They stopped. Not tactically, not cautiously, instinctively. The commanders had seen the flash. They had seen a tank die without an explosion, without warning. That wasn't how infantry weapons were supposed to work. One Panzer began reversing immediately, its driver desperate to create distance from something he couldn't see. The other rotated its turret, searching for a threat that left no signature. Neither fired. They didn't know where to aim. Morrison didn't give them time to figure it out. He reloaded. His loader, Private Eddie Kowalski, was already there, sliding the second M6A 3-round into the tube with practiced speed. Kowalski had seen the demonstration in England weeks earlier. He had believed it then. "Turret ring if you can," he whispered. "Even if it doesn't penetrate, it might jam the traverse." One stiff. Morrison adjusted his stance. The second Panzer was backing away at roughly 8 miles per hour, about 90 yards out, too far for comfort. And the angle wasn't ideal. Under old rules, this shot wouldn't even be attempted. But the rules were already breaking. Morrison led the target slightly and squeezed the trigger. The rocket ignited with the same sharp crack. It took longer to cross the distance this time. He counted without meaning to. 1. The impact flash was identical. Small, white. The rocket struck the glacis plate at an oblique angle, roughly 20 degrees off perpendicular. Normally, that would have meant failure. For a second, the tank kept moving. Then it slowed. Then it stopped completely. The engine died. No hatches opened. No crew escaped. The Panzer sat motionless in the fog, silent except for something burning deep inside. Morrison could smell it now. A chemical stench mixed with oil and scorched metal. And something else. Something human. The third Panzer was already gone. Its commander had made the only rational decision left. When two tanks are destroyed in less than 2 minutes by an invisible threat, you don't advance. You withdraw and report. The forest fell quiet. Not the calm kind. The stunned kind. Morrison climbed out of his foxhole. His hands were shaking violently now, worse than before the shots. The adrenaline had nowhere to go. Kowalski was grinning, repeating the same words under his breath like he couldn't stop himself. They approached the first tank cautiously. The crewman, who had escaped the hatch, lay frozen where he fell. The fire had done its work quickly. Morrison didn't look at the face. He climbed onto the turret and peered into the commander's cupola. The entry point was exactly where he had aimed. Inside, the damage was absolute. The shaped charge jet had passed through ammunition storage, detonating rounds in the confined space. Metal fragments had ricocheted through instruments, seats, bodies. The temperature inside must have spiked beyond 2,000 degrees for a fraction of a second. Fast. That's what Morrison told himself. Charlie Company's lieutenant arrived moments later with a squad. He stopped short when he saw the 2 dead Panzers. He looked at Morrison, then at the bazooka, then at the red-banded rounds in Kowalski's pack. "What the hell did they give you?" he asked. Morrison handed him the technical manual. "Something that works, sir." End quote. By late morning, every bazooka team in the battalion was issued M6A 3 rounds. By mid-afternoon, more German armor was burning. By nightfall, intercepted German radio traffic began mentioning a new American infantry weapon with extreme penetration capability. Tank crews were warned to increase engagement distances, to avoid close infantry contact, to treat every American soldier carrying a tube as a lethal threat. This wasn't a tactical adjustment. It was psychological. For the first time in the war, German tank crews could not tell which infantryman was harmless and which one could kill them outright. From 200 yards, a rifle and a bazooka looked the same, so they assumed the worst, and that assumption slowed them. It forced caution where speed had once ruled. It consumed time where momentum had once carried them forward. Morrison didn't know any of this yet. He was still standing beside two dead tanks, trying to steady his hands. But the effect of what he had done was already spreading outward, far beyond that frozen patch of forest. The first kill had proven something that could not be unproven. Infantry no longer needed to wait for armor to save them. They could do it themselves. And once that knowledge took hold, nothing about armored warfare would feel the same again. Wars don't change when one tank dies. They change when reports start repeating the same sentence. Within hours of Morrison's engagement, German radio traffic began to shift in tone. Not panic, not disbelief, concern. The early messages were cautious. Mentions of unexplained losses, isolated incidents, possibly lucky hits. German armored doctrine had survived surprises before. A single destroyed Panzer meant nothing. But by the end of the day, the language hardened. Reports described tanks disabled by infantry rockets at ranges previously considered safe, crew casualties without visible external damage, vehicles rendered inoperable without secondary explosions. This wasn't luck. By December 20th, German commanders were reporting something they hadn't had to consider in years. Infantry-heavy terrain was no longer safe for armor. That mattered. The Ardennes offensive depended on speed. German units were pushing through forest roads and narrow corridors, counting on armored spearheads to break resistance before American armor could respond. The entire plan assumed one constant. Infantry could not reliably stop tanks. Once that assumption failed, everything slowed. American after-action reports began to tell the same story from the opposite side. Bazooka teams that had previously avoided armor engagements were now seeking them out, not recklessly, deliberately. The numbers reflected the change. Between December 18th and December 31st, American infantry using M6A3 heat rounds destroyed or disabled 127 German armored vehicles. That number included dozens of Panzer IVs, over 30 Panthers, even Tiger's vehicles once thought immune to infantry weapons. The success rate mattered more than the raw count. 68% of M6A3 engagements resulted in a disabled or destroyed vehicle. Before that, bazooka effectiveness hovered around 30%. That difference changed behavior. Infantrymen who had once scattered at the sound of tracks began holding positions. Some began maneuvering aggressively, not because they felt invincible, but because they felt capable. German tank crews noticed immediately. They increased engagement distances wherever terrain allowed. They avoided closing with infantry unless supported by heavy screening units. They adjusted movement times, favoring low visibility periods to disrupt targeting. These adaptations slowed advances. Slower advances meant missed objectives. Missed objectives meant exposure to counterattacks. Armor that hesitates becomes a liability. Psychology amplified the effect. German crews could not tell which American soldiers carried the new rounds. At 200 yards, a rifleman and a bazooka operator looked identical, so tank commanders assumed every foxhole was dangerous. That assumption forced caution. Caution consumed time. Time was the one resource German forces did not have. American production scaled aggressively. By January 1945, M6A3 output reached approximately 250,000 rounds per month. That scale introduced new problems. The copper liners required precision machining. Even minor imperfections disrupted jet formation. Copper became a bottleneck. Each warhead required nearly a pound of high-quality copper. At full production, that translated into roughly 100 tons of copper per month, devoted solely to bazooka ammunition. Logistics adjusted. Rounds were shipped in specially padded containers to protect the fragile nose cones. Handling instructions were stenciled directly onto crates. Infantry joked that they were fighting tanks with rockets that had to be treated like glass. The joke masked a serious truth. The weapon worked only if treated correctly. German countermeasures followed quickly. Tank crews welded spare track links to hulls and turrets to trigger premature detonation. Some units added spaced armor or metal mesh screens ahead of critical surfaces. Others coated armor with mud and debris, hoping to disrupt standoff distance. These measures worked sometimes. Other times, they didn't. The shaped charged jet did not behave like a conventional projectile. Its velocity and pressure allowed it to punch through obstacles that should have neutralized it. This unpredictability made planning difficult. What mattered most was not whether every tank could be stopped. It was that no tank crew could be certain they wouldn't be. That uncertainty spread faster than the weapon itself. By mid-January, German intelligence had identified the M6A3 and issued formal warnings to armored units. Engagement guidelines were updated. Risk assessments recalculated. But the damage was already done. Once infantry believed they could kill tanks, they stopped acting like prey. Once tank crews believed infantry could kill them, they stopped acting like predators. That shift didn't require massive destruction. It required reliability. American infantry didn't need to win every engagement. They needed tanks to hesitate. They needed armored units to slow. They needed time, and the M6A3 gave them that. By February 1945, American intelligence estimated that shape-charged bazooka rounds accounted for over 20% of German armored losses on the Western Front. By March, that figure climbed even higher as units' refined tactics and experience spread. None of this made headlines. There was no single battle where historians pointed and said, "This is where it changed." Wait, Braid. The shift was quiet, incremental, measured in radio intercepts, altered movement patterns, and small adjustments that compounded over weeks. That is how most wars actually change. Not through miracles, through broken assumptions. Back in the forest near Bastogne, Morrison never saw these reports. He didn't see the charts or read the intercept summaries. He only knew that when tanks appeared again weeks later, they behaved differently. They stayed farther back. They moved slower. They respected infantry in a way they never had before. That respect wasn't born of fear. It was born of evidence. The numbers had spoken, and once they did, armor never regained the psychological dominance it once held. The war hadn't ended, but something fundamental had shifted. Infantry was no longer waiting to be saved. They had become a factor. The M6A3 did not turn infantry into tank hunters overnight. It gave them a chance, and chances, in war, come with a price. The weapon worked, but only when soldiers understood its limits, and many didn't at first. The shape charge was precise, not forgiving. Its effectiveness depended on conditions that were easy to misunderstand under fire. The most critical factor was distance, not range. Distance at the moment of impact. The standoff nose cone was designed to collapse and stop the warhead at exactly the right gap from the armor. If anything interfered with that sequence even slightly, the physics failed. Branches, fence posts, tall grass, even uneven ground. If the nose cone struck something before the armor surface, the detonation happened too early. The jet never fully formed. Penetration dropped sharply. Some early engagements ended with bazooka teams firing successfully, only to watch the round splash harmlessly against a tank that should have died. Those moments were dangerous, because belief cut both ways. When the weapon failed unexpectedly, old instincts returned immediately. Freeze, doubt, run. Angle mattered as well. Shaped charges were not magic. They didn't ignore geometry. A hit close to perpendicular delivered maximum penetration. At 30 degrees, effectiveness dropped significantly. At 45, the jet could fail entirely. Tank crews learned this quickly. They presented sloped surfaces deliberately. They rotated hulls. They used terrain to force oblique angles. The M6A3 reduced the advantage of sloped armor. It did not erase it. Range created another problem. Official manuals listed effective ranges out to 300 yards, In practice, accuracy degraded rapidly beyond half that distance. The rocket wobbled in flight. The shaped charge shifted the center of gravity forward. Small instabilities multiplied over distance. At 200 yards, hits became unreliable. At 250, they became hopeful. Veteran bazooka teams learned an unofficial rule: 150 yards or closer. Anything beyond that was gambling. Weather complicated everything. Extreme cold reduced explosive sensitivity. Some rounds failed to detonate entirely below certain temperatures. Heat created storage risks. Humidity corroded copper liners, introducing microscopic imperfections that disrupted jet formation. Soldiers improvised. Rounds were stored in sleeping bags to keep temperatures stable. Daily inspections became routine. Nose cones were checked obsessively. Even shallow dents could compromise the weapon. Damaged rounds weren't fired, they were discarded. That decision cost time, and sometimes lives. German countermeasures evolved. Track links welded to turrets and hulls created spaced barriers. Metal mesh screens were added ahead of armor surfaces. Mud and debris were layered on vehicles to trigger premature detonation. Some of these measures worked. Others failed catastrophically. A shaped charge jet that retained enough coherence could punch through track links, mesh, and mud with little loss of effectiveness. The inconsistency was its own form of pressure. Tank crews could never be sure whether their countermeasures would save them or make no difference at all. That uncertainty shaped behavior more than the weapon itself. But mistakes were inevitable. Bazooka teams sometimes fired from poor positions. Sometimes they rushed shots under pressure. Sometimes they misunderstood what they were aiming at. Those mistakes were punished immediately. A failed shot revealed position. A revealed position invited machine gun fire, coaxial weapons, and artillery. Infantry paid for every lesson in blood. Not every story ended like Morrison's. Some teams died learning which angles worked, which distances mattered, which obstacles ruined the shot. There was no training manual that could prepare them for all of it, only experience. And experience cost lives. Even when the weapon worked perfectly, the aftermath carried weight. The shaped charge did not kill cleanly. The jet turned the inside of a tank into a confined blast chamber. Temperatures spiked. Fragments ricocheted. Survivors who looked inside destroyed vehicles did not forget what they saw. Many didn't talk about it. Some couldn't stop thinking about it. This was not a heroic narrative. It was a transactional one. Infantry gained the ability to fight back. Armor lost the certainty that protected it. Both sides paid for the adjustment. Engineers knew the M6A3 was not a final solution. It was an emergency answer to an immediate problem. Its fragility, limited handling, its dependence on copper-strained supply chains. Its performance varied with conditions that war could not control. But it worked often enough, and often enough was all that mattered. The weapon did not eliminate tanks. It forced them to behave differently. That distinction is critical. Wars rarely turn on perfect solutions. They turn on tools that break expectations. The M6A3 broke the expectation that infantry was helpless. It did not make them dominant, it made them dangerous. That danger changed decision-making on both sides. German commanders slowed advances. American units held longer. Defensive lines bent instead of snapping. Momentum shifted not because tanks disappeared, but because certainty did. By the time these lessons were fully absorbed, the war was already moving toward its conclusion. New weapons were on the horizon, larger shaped charges, more reliable designs. But the psychological shift remained. Infantry had learned something irreversible. They were no longer required to wait. They could act. They could choose. And even when the weapon failed, the belief that it could work changed how they fought. That belief did not make them fearless. It made them deliberate. And deliberation in war is often the difference between survival and disappearance. The M6A3 did not end the war, but it ended an era where armor moved through infantry without consequence. What came next was not cleaner, not easier, just different. And difference in December 1944 was enough. Wars do not end when the shooting stops. They end when the people who survived finally stop carrying them. For most of the men who fired M6A3 rounds in the winter of 1944 and early 1945, that never fully happened. On paper, the weapons story was simple. It worked. It spread. It helped blunt German armored momentum during the final months of the war. Production numbers climbed. Reports accumulated. Commanders adjusted doctrine. By the time Germany surrendered, the M6A3 had proven itself beyond debate, and then it quietly disappeared. Manufacturing stopped within months of VJ Day. Millions of rounds sat in depots, classified as war reserve stock. Most were eventually dismantled or destroyed as newer weapons replaced them. Officially, the M6A3 became obsolete, but for the men who had used it, the weapon never stopped existing. Sergeant Jim Morrison survived the Battle of the Bulge. He survived the Rhineland fighting. He survived the final push into Germany. He returned home in late 1945 with medals, paperwork, and injuries that had no name at the time. They called it combat fatigue. He was told to move on. Morrison did what most veterans did. He went home. He found work. He built a life that looked normal from the outside. He worked at a meatpacking plant in Iowa for decades, married, had children, and almost never talked about the war, except once. In 1987, his grandson interviewed him for a school history project. It was supposed to be simple. Where were you? What did you do? What was it like? Morrison talked about the cold, about the exhaustion, about the sound of tanks. He talked about firing the bazooka, and then he talked about what he saw afterward. The burned crewmen, the smell inside the tank, the knowledge that the men inside had never known what killed them. He told his grandson something that never appeared in any report. "Don't ever let anyone tell you war is glorious," he said. "It's killing, and then living with what you did." Where to? The weapon had saved his life. It had saved his friends. And it had killed men who were doing their jobs just like he was. That contradiction never resolved itself. Morrison died in 2003 at the age of 82. When his family cleared out his attic, they found a box he had never mentioned. Inside were his uniform, his bronze star, and a single spent M6A3 rocket casing. The nose cone was crushed flat from impact. He had carried it home from Europe and kept it for 58 years, not as a trophy, as a reminder. Private Eddie Kowalski did not live long enough to carry anything home. He was killed by artillery fire on January 31st, 1945, 19 years old. He never returned to the Ford plant in Detroit, never used his mechanical instincts for anything except war. His name is carved into a memorial wall in Luxembourg, one of many. The engineers who designed the M6A3 fared differently. Most never received public recognition. Some names were lost in bureaucracy. Others remained classified for years. They didn't get medals. They didn't get parades. They got a contract completed, a weapon delivered, and the knowledge that their calculations had kept soldiers alive, that was the reward. For decades after the war, much of the M6A3's design remained restricted. Details about liner angles, explosive composition, and standoff distances were deliberately obscured, not because the weapon was obsolete, but because it wasn't. The same physics that killed German tanks in 1944 could kill Soviet tanks in a future war. The Cold War made secrecy a continuation of combat by other means. Veterans were discouraged, sometimes explicitly, from discussing details. The story faded from public memory, but the technology didn't. Shaped charge principles evolved rapidly after the war. Larger warheads, improved reliability, better fusing. By the early 1952, the Super Bazooka appeared, then disposable launchers, then systems like the Law and AT-4. Eventually, tandem-shaped charges and top-attack missiles like Javelin. Each one carried a direct lineage back to a frozen foxhole in Belgium, to a moment when infantry stopped running. Modern soldiers carry these weapons without knowing their origin. They trust them. They assume they work. That assumption is the legacy, not heroism, not glory, capability, the ability to fight back, the ability to survive. The war ended in 1945, but its solutions didn't. They traveled forward in time, embedded in doctrine, manufacturing, and design. They shaped conflicts that Morrison never saw, wars he never heard about, battles fought by people who never knew his name. The M6A3 did not change history in a dramatic moment. It did something quieter. It removed helplessness, and once that was gone, nothing ever felt the same again. Most soldiers who carry modern anti-tank weapons have never heard of the M6A3. They don't need to. The weapon did its job long before they were born. Today, an infantryman can shoulder a launcher and expect it to work. Not sometimes, not under perfect conditions, but reliably. That expectation did not exist before 1944. It had to be built, piece by piece, failure by failure, at the cost of lives no report ever fully captured. After the war, shape-charge technology did not slow down. It accelerated. Engineers expanded the same principles that saved Morrison's life. They increased caliber, improved liner geometry, refined fuses. By the early 1950s, the M20 Super Bazooka appeared, capable of penetrating armor nearly 3 times thicker than its World War II predecessor. Then came disposable launchers, lighter, simpler, designed for mass issue. The idea was no longer to give infantry a chance. It was to make armor respect them by default. The Soviet RPG-7 carried forward the same logic: a shaped charge, controlled standoff, and reliability under poor conditions. Western armies followed parallel paths. Law, at patru, Panzerfaust, derivatives reborn in new forms. Eventually, the concept reached its logical extreme: top attack missiles, tandem warheads, weapons designed not just to defeat armor, but to defeat armor designed to defeat them. Every step traced back to one realization: armor does not lose wars because it is destroyed. It loses wars because it stops being decisive. That lesson remains relevant. Modern conflicts still revolve around confidence. When armored units believe they can move freely, they dominate terrain. When they believe infantry might stop them, everything changes. Routes are reconsidered. Timelines stretch. Momentum slows. The weapon does not need to be fired to have an effect. It only needs to be present. That psychological leverage, the removal of helplessness, is the true legacy of the M6A3. It taught armies something uncomfortable: that dominance is fragile. That doctrine can fail silently. That the smallest overlooked assumption can undo years of preparation. And it taught infantry something even more important: that survival does not always come from strength. Sometimes it comes from understanding physics, understanding systems, understanding where the rules stop applying. The men who first learned that lesson did not frame it as history. They framed it as necessity. They were not trying to change the war. They were trying to survive the next 5 minutes. That is why their stories matter. Not because they were exceptional, but because they were ordinary men placed at the intersection of desperation and innovation. Morrison never considered himself part of a turning point. He fired because he had to. Kowalski loaded the round because that was his job. The engineers designed the weapon because the casualty lists demanded it. No one involved was thinking about legacy. Yet legacy emerged anyway. It emerged every time infantry stopped running, every time a tank commander hesitated, every time a decision took longer because the old certainty was gone. History often credits victories to generals and strategies. But wars are also shaped by quieter forces. A measurement corrected by fractions of an inch. A design choice that looks insignificant until it isn't. A principle of physics applied at exactly the right moment. The M6A3 was not a miracle. It was a correction to an assumption that had been killing people. And once corrected, it never needed to be corrected again. That is why, decades later, soldiers still trust weapons built on the same idea. They do not question whether armor can be killed. They question how best to do it. That shift from doubt to expectation is the true end of the story. Not glory, not triumph. Capability, the ability to act instead of endure, to choose instead of wait. In December 1944, that choice appeared in a frozen forest for the first time. It has never fully disappeared since. If this story stayed with you, it's because it isn't really about tanks or weapons. It's about the moment when a system that seemed unbeatable revealed a weakness no one had wanted to look for. Those moments are rare, but when they happen, they reshape everything that follows. Remember that, because history does not belong only to the powerful. It belongs to those who find the flaw and have the nerve to use it.